Hello, all. Tonight I'm going to do my top 10 favorite science fiction movies of all time. What I consider the best science fiction movies. I realize I've done a lot of videos about bad science fiction movies, but I want to do one about good ones too. This list is going to be chronological rather than in the order of the ones I like the best. Um, because actually, the one I like the best is number 8 on my list. They start in 1927 with Fritz Lang's Metropolis, a tale of a utopian futuristic city where the elite live in luxury and the workers live in absolute misery and are basically little more than slaves. The son of the leader of the high city, named John Frater, discovers a beautiful teacher played by Brigitte Helm, named Maria, who is taking some low city children around, and he falls in love with her, and this leads to some interesting consequences. His father, one of the workers who works for his father, shows him what they call plans. He said, "We keep finding these on the men, and we don't know what they are." Well, he sends a spy, which is the evil Professor Dr. Rotwang, and that's a great name, down to the lower city to figure out what these plans are. He sees a secret meeting between the workers and Maria, who is exhorting them, you're being badly treated, and you're not being paid well enough, and you're not being fed well enough, and you're not being housed well enough, and you need to ask the leaders of the city to provide better for you. And Rotwang goes back to his master and reports what he saw. John Frater is very upset. He says, "What are we going to do about this?" Well, Rotwang has an idea. After a very elaborate party held in the upper city, he kidnaps Maria, and he has a female robot, which is featureless, and he uses Maria and passes some sort of electrical beam over her, and it transfers her image onto the robot. So now he has a programmable Maria that he can use for Frater's means. And what she does is she starts going down and exhorting the workers to violence and to fight amongst each other, and basically derails this plan for them to ask for better rights. John Fraterson, the boy, discovers this and is determined that he's going to free the real Maria and convince people this isn't the real one. And he does so in basically the last few minutes. It's very thrilling. Dr. Rotwang is destroyed, Professor Rotwang, rather, is destroyed, and the real Maria is freed, and the head of the workers and John Frater shake hands, and his son places his hand between the two of them and says, "Between the head and the hands, the heart must be the mediator." I thought that was a wonderful message. It's a great message film. It does all the things that science fiction is supposed to. It asks us what if, but it also takes social issues and puts them into a future context. I thought it was really brilliantly done. The next is 1950. Yeah, I'm going to jump you up in time to 1951 to what I think is the best film of the 50s, science fiction film, The Day the Earth Stood Still, starring Michael Rennie and Patricia Neal and Sam Jaffe, directed by Robert Wise. And it's really a terrific film. The premise is that a UFO, a flying saucer, lands on the mall in Washington, and soldiers come out to meet it, and they're very tense, and they don't know what's going to happen. And Michael Rennie, as a humanoid alien named Klaatu, steps out. He speaks English, and he says he's here to, on a peaceful mission, and he's going to give them a gift for the president. Well, one of the soldiers sees that the gift has sort of a spiky aspect, and he thinks it's a weapon, and he shoots him. He's instantly met with hostility the minute he steps onto Earth. Well, he has a robot with him named Gort, who's like 8 feet tall, and he disintegrates all the soldiers' guns and the tanks and the artillery that they brought. It doesn't harm any people, but destroys the equipment. And now they know, this guy's for real. They take him to Walter Reed Hospital to patch him up. And during the course of interrogation, when he doesn't really tell them very much, he tells them he wants to meet with all the world leaders, and they tell him, well, that's not possible. And he vanishes mysteriously. He ends up at a boarding house. He stole the uniform of a man named Major Carpenter, and he takes on the name John Carpenter, and which is something of a Christ reference. And he enters this boarding house and asks if he can have a room. And Patricia Neal and her son also stay there. And the people are a little bit suspicious, but they go ahead and rent him the room. And he starts hanging out with the boy to discover certain aspects about normal life, and reveals some interesting things like his people use diamonds for money, and that they have cemeteries but they don't have any wars on where he comes from. He doesn't tell anybody where he comes from. They go to visit the professor who his Patricia Neal works for, who's a physicist. And he's not there, but Klaatu notices a very complex physics equation on his blackboard, and he starts shaking his head. He says, "What's wrong?" He says, "Well, he'll never figure it out that way." And they enter through a window, and he checks off certain things as being correct, and then he corrects a certain portion that wasn't correct. A housemaid comes in, and she says, "How dare you write on that blackboard?" She's about to erase it. He says, "Oh, don't do that. Professor Barnhart needs that very badly, and here's my calling card." And he gives him he writes his name and where he's staying. Later on, Professor Barnhart sends men to, pick him up, and they do, and he comes, and the soldiers are first, kind of questioning, who is this guy? Is he a spy? And he says, "Oh no, I know this gentleman." And he reveals that he is Klaatu, and that he wants to meet with all the leaders of the world, and Barnhart tells him, "Well, that's not going to be possible. We have all these conflicts," and he says, "Well, it's very important." He said, "Well, could you meet with a bunch of top scientists? I can possibly arrange that." And he says, "Yes, that will do." And he said, "Well, what happens if we don't?" And he says, "Well, if you don't cooperate, the Earth could be a burnt-out cinder." And he says, "Does that power exist?" He said, "Oh, I assure you, such power exists." So now he's kind of upset, and he says, "Well, can you do something to demonstrate this power, but in a minor way, something that would be, noticeable, demonstrable, but wouldn't hurt anybody?" And Klaatu says, "Yeah, I think I can come up with something." Well, what he does is rather ingenious. He stops all the electricity in the world except in cases where someone will be harmed, like airplanes in flight, ships at sea, people in hospitals, that sort of thing. But the rest of the world, the normal world, comes to a stop for half an hour. Nobody can figure it out. And then later on, one of the boarders, who's Patricia Neal's fiance, kind of starts having suspicions about that. He doesn't like the fact that Klaatu's hanging around with her son, and that she's hanging around with him that much. He's kind of jealous. And one day the boy goes out in the middle of the night. Klaatu asks the boy, "Do you have a flashlight?" He says, "Yeah, sure." And he hands it to him, shows him how to use it. He follows him out into the mall, and he goes out and flashes some signals to Gort, who then goes back into the spaceship. And he sneaks back home, and he says, Mom, you won't guess what I've seen." She says, "What are you doing out so late?" And he tells her, and she won't believe him. Sends him up to his room. And then she said, "Wait a minute, why are your feet so wet?" He said, "Well, it was kind of wet out there." And now she's kind of going, "What the?" She can't figure out what's going on. The fiance again basically piece it together, the fact that the guy's Klaatu, and he reports him into the government. The government starts chasing him. There's a chase scene and a fight, and Klaatu is mortally wounded and brought to a jail cell. Well, Gort bursts through the jail cell, burns the wall down with his laser, and takes Klaatu back to the spaceship. Klaatu had told Patricia Neal, "If anything happens to me, go to Gort and say the words Klaatu Barada Nikto." Makes her repeat it. And she does that, and then, although it looks like Gort's going to attack her, he doesn't. He just takes her and Klaatu back into the spaceship, where he revives Klaatu with a very advanced-looking machine, some sort of sonic instrument. Klaatu is now revived. He comes out and addresses a meeting of basically military people on the wall and tells them, "Look, as long as you people, I'm from another planet, and as long as you Earth people were, confining your petty wars to your tanks and airplanes, we didn't care. But now you're starting to experiment with atomic power, and soon you'll apply it to space flight. And if you take your aggression to the stars, we won't tolerate it. Just like you, we have laws, and for our policemen, we built this race of robots. And if they if any of us in our galactic federation acts with aggression or violence towards each other, they instantly destroy the source of the violence. And if you guys, Earth doesn't want to suffer this fate, you need to change your way of thinking. And then he leaves. I thought that was a very good message. It was a very interesting film. Again, asked some of these big what ifs. Very good science fiction. My third on my list is also from the 1950s. In 1953's It Came from Outer Space, which was a movie based on a treatment by Ray Bradbury, written by Harry Essex, and it was in 3D, though I've never seen it in 3D. But it's about a meteorite which lands in the Arizona desert somewhere, and a scientist and his girlfriend watch it and decide they want to go out and investigate. They have a friend who has a helicopter, and he lets them come with him to the site. The scientist discovers that the meteorite is in fact some sort of a spherical spaceship, and a hatch is about, hexagonal-shaped hatch is about to open, and whoever's in it is about to come out, and then it's buried by a rock slide. So that doesn't happen. He goes to the sheriff and tells him about it, and he says, oh yeah, sure. He doesn't believe him. But then some odd things start to happen, and some of the townspeople start disappearing, and when they return, they're acting kind of like zombies. They're sort of robotic, and they seem like they're physically okay, but like there's something wrong with them mentally. One of these people is, by the way, is Kenneth Johnson, who played the professor on Gilligan's Island. He was very good in this movie. The scientist convinces the sheriff that there's something real going on here, and he wants to go back out to the site. Well, they go back out into the desert, and they see some kind of weird trail of phosphorescent something, and then it just sort of disappears. And a spider starts crawling towards the sheriff, and he says, what would you do if that spider came towards you? And the sheriff says, this, and he stomps on it. And the scientist asks him, why did you do that? Because its mouth moves up and down or from side to side instead of up and down like ours, or because it has 8 legs instead of 2? That's kind of the central premise of this thing. It's revealed finally to the scientist, rather reluctantly, by the commander of this space expedition, that they're not humanoid, that they came to Earth by accident. They were going someplace else, and their ship crashed, and all they want to do is repair it and go home. They promise they won't harm anybody. They're not here to conquer the Earth. They just want to leave. And the reason that they've been taking the people over is they need certain parts to fix their spaceship. Well, the scientist says, well, I can't really trust you unless you let me see you. He says, you might find me hideous to your eyes, although you're hideous to ours. And he says, well, I promise you I won't have a bad reaction. But in fact, he does. When the creature reveals himself, he's kind of a bug-eyed monster. He has only one eye. He's kind of slimy and gross. He looks like a big jellyfish, if anything. And, he has a knee-jerk reaction, but he realizes after speaking with this creature that this is not something evil, that despite the fact that he looks different from us, he's actually a good person with a good soul and morals. And he says, okay, I agree, I'll help you. And he starts trying to convince the sheriff that these people are good and that they don't want to harm anybody. But the sheriff isn't really listening. He says, well, they're kidnapping people and we have to, get them back. And he starts forming what's basically a posse to go out to the mine to destroy these aliens. The scientist goes back to warn them, and his own girlfriend has been taken over, and she tries to kill him with an advanced laser beam, but he ducks and she misses, and the alien is actually killed instead. And he goes to the leader and begs him. They're going to turn the beam on the town now because they've formed this posse and they're going to destroy them. And he says, no, please don't do it. I'll go out and I'll convince them not to come in. And you can have the time you need to repair the ship. Well, the scientist goes out and he collapses the entranceway to the mine so the angry mob can't get in. And then the aliens take off. All the people who were kidnapped are returned unharmed. And the spaceship leaves. And the girl says, well, his girlfriend says, do you think they'll be back? He says, well, not for a while. We're not really ready to meet them yet, but hopefully someday we will. And I think that was a very good message. Also, I think maybe there was a little subtle dig at the civil rights movement. What will we do with people who look different from us? Well, I think that was intentional, both on the part of Harry Essex and Ray Bradbury. Um, Fourth on my list is the wonderful color film Forbidden Planet, starring Walter Pidgeon, Leslie Nielsen, and Anne Francis, and Robbie the Robot. Uh, it's ostensibly a loose adaptation of Shakespeare's The Tempest. It's about a expedition from Earth that's sent to the distant star Altair. Main sequence, I believe it's a red giant, because a mission to the fourth planet, Altair 4, vanished something like 50 years ago. And they want to find out what happened. One of the first films I saw that used the term hyperspace had a suspended animation sequence, which I thought was very well done. It had rather advanced looking ray guns, very interesting and somewhat practical spacesuits, pressure suits anyway. And they land on this planet. The science is led by Leslie Nielsen, who's their commander, and they find that there is a survivor, a professor named Morbius, he and his daughter, who was born on the planet just as the ship crashed, are the only survivors. And he tells them this story, shows them this wonderful city that was built by this race that he calls the Krell. And although he knows nothing about what they look like, and they didn't leave behind any photographic evidence or artwork, they have, each of the buildings has a characteristic sort of triangular arched doorway, which may indicate what their body form was like. Shows them this wonderful city that's like miles and miles and miles of vast machines and intricate nuclear reactors, and just goes on and on and on. He has no idea really what it's for. But the only thing he's discovered are a few of their machines that he can basically manipulate, including something called the plastic educator, which can create an image from your mind, but is just basically a hologram. And it measures your intelligence, and he says, according to the Krell, I'm basically a low-grade moron. And he's one of the most intelligent people on Earth. But he tells them that what began to happen is his crew began to die mysteriously. They were found, torn to pieces, and nobody understood it. And he fears that this is what happened to the Krell as well. One of the crew members, actually I think it's Leslie Nielsen, starts becoming attracted to Anne Francis, which is quite understandable, and strange things start to happen. A tiger that was her pet and never harmed anybody tries to kill him, and he's forced to kill it. And a series of mysterious murders starts to happen aboard his ship now. Again, men being torn apart by something, but it's apparently invisible. The only thing they find is that one of the steps of the spacecraft has been dented. When they make a castor plast, it's of like a giant single claw, and they don't know any creature that matches that physiology. And again, they set up a defense perimeter with a force field. Something is trying to breach the force field, and they force it back with lasers, and they see briefly an outline of a horrible monster that's enormous and has gigantic teeth and huge claws and really awful looking thing, but it vanishes when they fire at it. So they figure that they've killed it, but apparently they haven't, because the deaths continue. And Morbius is trying to explain it, and he finally comes up with the hypothesis, which is rather interesting in itself, that what happened to both the men on the spacecraft and the Krell is they became victims of their own id. The id is the portion of the brain that is childish and primitive and wants things, has wants, lusts, desires, but it has no control. It's not logical, it's not rational. And that what happened is that through the machines in this city, the id became activated to the point that it destroyed the Krell, and it's destroying them too. And what's happening now is Morbius, because he's jealous of the captain's love for his daughter in some way, which is a little bit creepy and incestuous, but has recreated this creature, and it's coming after them. and there's nothing he can do to stop it. He doesn't know how. Um, and even though he has, the other parts of the brain, the ego, which is the self, and the superego, which is the rational part of the brain that deals with, logic, he can't control this very primitive id that's being controlled by the Krell machines. And they escape at the last minute as the planet is basically destroyed, and they take Altera with them. Um, Good movie, very terrific special effects for the time, which still stand up somewhat today, including the animation of the monster, which was done by Disney Studios, and is really magnificent. If you watch it for anything, watch it for that. And also some of the funny jokes with Robbie the Robot and Anne Francis being kind of coy. Um, and the next movie, I'm going to jump us up from 1956 to 1968 to Planet of the Apes, the original, which I thought was fantastic when it came out, starring Charlton Heston and Roddy McDowall and Kim Novak and Maurice Evans as about a trio of astronauts who it was actually four, but they had a woman with them, and she was killed because her cryosleep chamber was destroyed. And when they get to the planet, she's a skeleton. But they get to this strange planet that's supposedly somewhere in Orion's belt, orbiting one of those stars. And it looks somewhat like Earth, but it seems to be a bit brighter. At first, there doesn't seem to be any sign of habitation. They walk around some lakes and a kind of a woodland area, and suddenly they start seeing signs of how they see something that looks like scarecrows, and they also their clothes are stolen all of a sudden when they go in for a dip in a pool, and finally they are suddenly being chased by someone across a cornfield, and they're eventually captured, knocked out. One of them is killed, and the other two are knocked out, and they wake up in the city, which is run by apes. And this society, chimpanzees, orangutans, and gorillas have evolved intelligence, and men are not intelligent. They're savage brutes, basically. And it's the story of how the astronaut tries to convince people. Humans don't talk either, and so when he says his famous line, "Get your sticky paws off me, you damn dirty apes," they're shocked and horrified that here's a human who can talk, and they think he's the product of some sort of a medical experiment, and they don't believe anything that he tells them about the fact that he came from Earth and where he was from and how he gained his education. They think it's all lies and a trick. And two chimpanzees who defend him are Cornelius and Zira, who are scientists and who believe him, basically. They take him against the advice of their chief science advisor, Dr. Zayas, played by Maurice Evans, to the archaeological site. And at the archaeological site, there is evidence of an earlier race of humanoids who were intelligent and spoke. And because he can't really allow that idea to exist in his society, Dr. Zayas orders the cave destroyed and all the evidence with it. And Taylor takes off with this woman who he's met, Nova, played by the beautiful Linda Harrison, and he's going to ride off with her into the sunset. And I won't spoil the ending for you, but it turns out they're not where they thought they were at all. Brilliant script by both Michael Dane and Rod Serling, and about 6 others at various points. But theirs was the one that was used, and that twist ending was written by Rod Serling. One of the classic twists in all science fiction. The next on my list is also from 1968, Stanley Kubrick's brilliant 2001: A Space Odyssey, written by both Kubrick and the magnificent science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke, who's one of my personal favorites. Story, basically the entire story of mankind, how we evolved, how we developed the ability to use tools, and how that took us into space, and then what would our next step possibly be. Also, an exploration of the dangers, potentially, of artificial intelligence and entrusting machines to do the work of men, as the computer HAL 9000 is introduced first as a benevolent entity, but later on he starts to become paranoid and act in unpredictable ways, which has a very disastrous effect on his crew. And he has to be turned off in one of the most heartbreaking sequences I've ever seen in a science fiction movie, which is where Hal is deactivated. And I actually started to cry when I saw it. I was 11 at the time, and I began to cry in that sequence because I felt so badly for Hal. Hal, ironically, was more human and more animated than Dave Mulman and Frank Poole, the two astronauts who he is meant to serve. And the ending, of course, is really trippy and weird and, open to interpretation, but basically a projection of what might be mankind's future. I thought it was brilliant. It was brilliantly written. Fantastic score. I meant to mention that in Planet of the Apes. I thought Jerry Goldsmith's score was classic. I love it. I still do. And the same with the the soundtrack of 2001, which is mostly classical music. Got a few things wrong, but like the fact that Pan Am no longer exists, but I don't think that really matters. The next one, I go up to the 1970s, and my favorite of many 1970 dystopian science fiction movies, Rollerball, with James Caan and John Houseman and Moses Gunn, and also the beautiful Maud Adams. Story of a future where there's no war, no poverty, no violence, but there is this violent sport, rollerball, which is kind of a cross between roller derby and motocross because it has motorcycles and skaters, and the objective is to get this big steel ball into a little cup, sort of like basketball. But other people or teams actually trying to kill you. They often do kill people. And it's about the champion of this sport, Jonathan E., played by James Caan, who has been asked by the corporate director, Mr. Bartholomew, to retire. And he doesn't understand why. In this projection of the future, all the nations of the world are bankrupt. The world is run by, I believe, 7 corporations: food, housing, energy, education, employment, healthcare, and luxury. And I think that's it. Those are like the major world corporations. They call them majors. And Bartholomew is the head of the Energy Corporation, which is based in Houston. And their team is the best rollerball team, and Jonathan is their champion. Well, it turns out that one of the reasons that he really wants him to retire is there wasn't supposed to be a champion. The game was meant to play up the futility of individual effort and the necessity for team effort, i.e. corporate kind of effort. The individual is not supposed to become a champion, and the fact that Jonathan is becoming a champion, is becoming very popular all over the world, is a threat. And so they keep making the games more and more dangerous, with the ultimate goal that if he won't retire, they're going to be forced to kill him, though they're not going to take any overt actions. They're not going to have him assassinated, but they're going to make the thing so tough that he can't survive it. Maud Adams was his former wife, who was taken away from him by a corporate executive when he wanted her, and she comes back and tries to warn him, Johnny, they're going to kill you. And in a very touching scene, he says, I just wanted one person, I just wanted you to be on my side. And then he erases every visual image of her that he ever had. And that's, again, a very, very sad, very touching scene. Maud Adams looks absolutely drop-dead gorgeous in that movie. I always thought she was, and I loved her in the Bond movie that she was in, too. Very good movie. The society has become so callous that for fun they shoot trees with laser beams and burn them. These are like some of the last trees existing. So that's what they take, drugs, and they burn up trees, and they act very infantile. And they relent to this corporations running everything. Another funny sequence that I like, where Jonathan goes to Geneva to try to find out more about the corporate wars and what happened, how this society came to be. And he asks a computer named Zero, which is basically made out of water, and it won't tell him. And it's kind of a funny sequence, which I thought was interesting. Another interesting look at artificial intelligence. This one's kind of dumb, really. Next, from 1976, another of my favorite dystopian 70s movies, Logan's Run. A lot of people don't like this movie. A lot of people think it's silly or stupid, and I don't. I actually find it quite interesting, and for the time, it deals with a society which is basically worships youth to the point that once you reach, you're implanted with what's called a life clock, which is a crystal in the palm of your hand, and at first the crystal is clear, I think, from age 0 to age 10. Then it turns yellow from 10 to, I think it's 16. Then it goes green from 16 to 25. And from 25 it starts to go red. When the red starts flashing, when you get 30, you have to die. You're put on a machine called carousel, which spins you around and lifts you up into the air on sort of an anti-gravity field, and then you're shot with a laser beam, and allegedly people quote-unquote renew, but in fact they're just killed. And people know this, and they're trying to run. They're called runners, and they're chased by policemen known as Sandmen. Michael York is one of these Sandmen named Logan 5, and he is asked by his command to find these runners and to find out what something called sanctuary. And the only thing they know about sanctuary is it's symbolized by an ankh, and people who wear this are runners. And he tries to he encounters one of these people who is played by okay, why am I forgetting this? Jenny Agutter, again, another very beautiful British actress, and she doesn't trust him at first. She thinks he's a spy, and he's not a runner. They make him look like a runner. They make his life clock start flashing. He asks him, "I'm going to get my years back," and the computer won't answer him. But he lets a runner go, and then the other Sandmen begin to think, that he is actually a runner. And finally, Jenny Agutter, even though he tries to get him killed at first, Beast starts to believe him too, and agrees to lead him to Sanctuary, leads him to through a series of dangerous adventures. He's being chased by his former friend Francis Seven, and goes outside the seals of the city using this ankh, which is a key, and actually activates an exit through what's kind of like a fishery. And they go through this ordeal. They're met by a robot played by Russell Lee Brown. Wonderful performance as this strange robot called Box, who has been freezing all the runners who have escaped from the city. So the truth is there is no sanctuary, and they're the first ones who escape him. Manage to destroy him and escape, and they see that the world outside is not what they're told. It's not this horrible hellscape. It's actually the overgrown ruins of Washington D.C. They see things like the Lincoln Memorial, and they don't understand. And Michael York says that must be the look of getting old. And they meet a marvelous kind of a bum character played by the great Peter Ustinov. And he tells them, about cats and about what happened to his parents, and he's never seen people like them before, their clothing or anything, or their life clocks, and they're going to bring him back to the city as a way to show people that everything they've been taught is a lie. There's some complications along the way. They end up having to kill Francis, and he sees Logan's life clock, which is now clear, and says, "Logan, you've renewed." Even though it's not true, he's just no longer under the outside the influence field of the life clock computer. They go back to the city, destroy the computer, free everybody, and they all end up going to take a look at Walter Ustinov, and they're amazed because they've never seen anybody old before. Interesting movie. It's dystopian, but it has a happy ending, which is unusual for 1970s dystopian films. Number 9 on my list is the one I said was actually my number 1, is Blade Runner from 1982. The brilliant adaptation by Ridley Scott of Philip K. Dick's novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. In explaining that title a little bit, in the book, there's been a Third World War called World War Terminus, and most of mankind has been wiped out, along with most animals. So real animals are rare, but electric ones can be purchased. And androids are also now popular, and the only difference between androids and humans is that androids don't feel empathy. There's also a test to detect this called Voight-Kampff, which measures pupillary reactions, and there's also a bone marrow test that can detect them. But other than that, they're exactly like humans. Rick Deckard is a jaded cop whose job it is to retire or kill these androids, and his wife hates him unless she turns her quote-unquote Penfield mood organ up to a different setting that makes her not hate him. Penfield, by the way, was an actual name of an actual scientist who worked on mental health and things of that nature. And Dick knew that. Anyway, in the movie, it's transposed that Deckard is now a retired quote-unquote Blade Runner, which was a special police unit made to track down replicants, which are these androids with a brain almost indistinguishable from humans. They're illegal on Earth because they rebelled in an off-world colony and killed a bunch of colonists. So it's illegal for them to come to Earth, and once they're on Earth, they can be quote-unquote retired without mercy. And 4 of them have appeared on Earth. They jumped a shuttle and they killed its crew. And Deckard's old boss tries to recruit him and says, you have to stop these androids. They're really bad. This is the worst one yet. And convinces him to do this. And this movie is his journey into what's going on with these people. It asks some very basic questions, which were very typical of Philip K. Dick's and of science fiction in general, which are, what makes us human? Could a robot, given human memories and human feelings, be human? And are we more than just the sum of our memories? If not, what are we? What makes us different than a machine? And these ideas are explored brilliantly, I think, in this movie. The fantastic performances by Rutger Hauer, William Sanderson, and Daryl Hannah and Joanna Cassidy as some of these replicants and the people around them, and also Joe Turkel as Eldon Tyrell, the sort of head scientist of the Tyrell Corporation, which created them. There's a great kind of Frankensteinian scene between Tyrell and Roy Batty, played by Rutger Hauer, where he asks him, what do you want? And he says, I want more life, Father. And he can't give it to him. They've built in a 4-year lifespan to prevent the replicants from being too human. Meanwhile, Deckard has met Rachel, who is a special replicant, and he's starting to fall in love with her. So now he's kind of questioning, is this right what I'm doing? He has to do it because it's his job, but he no longer really feels good about it. And is starting to question, what he's been told. Is this the really true? Are the replicants bad, or is it really humans, who are bad? And in the end, these issues are left unresolved. But I really like that movie. It doesn't matter whether you think Deckard is a replicant or not. That's not really relevant to the overall context or subtext. And the brilliant visuals, brilliant lighting by Jordan Cronowith, and futuristic landscapes directed by Sid Mead, the art director, and a great soundtrack, wonderfully edited. I like that there are, of course, apparently 7 different versions of it. I like the final cut, quote-unquote, the best of all of them. Although I do have a penchant for the work print as well, which, although it has a different soundtrack, use some of the Planet of the Apes movies, the music, ironically, is interesting in its own way. Has a different voiceover, which is more sardonic than the one in the theatrical release. Number 10 was hard for me to choose. There are a lot of good science fiction movies out there. I wanted to do a more recent one. I thought about doing Dark City by Alex Proyas, which I really enjoy, starring Rufus Sewell and Richard O'Brien. And yes, that Richard O'Brien, the one who wrote the Rocky Horror Picture Show and played Riff Raff. And Jennifer Connelly, William Hurt, Kiefer Sutherland in a wonderful role, and Sir Ralph Richardson, about a guy who wakes up and he doesn't know, not only doesn't he not know where he is, doesn't know who he is, and has to discover this through a series of very strange events. And again, I won't spoil that one. That's not my number 10, but it's a runner-up. I thought about doing Interstellar as my number 10, but it's been done a little too much, and I don't mean to go against the grain, but I'm not a really big fan of Christopher Nolan's science fiction movies. I liked his Batman series quite a lot. Um, I did like Inception. I thought that was an interesting movie because it deals with dreams, and I like that as a subject matter um, for science fiction. But something about it just made me go, this isn't that great. Um, a number of other movies kind of vied, but the one that I chose was from, it's actually from 2022, or 2020 rather, and it's a British movie called Archive, directed and written by George Rothery, and starring Theo James and Stacey Martin, um, and also Rona, the lovely Rona Mitra, is has a part in it, and Toby James, who famously played Alfred Hitchcock and both looks and sounds a lot like him, is really good in this too. It's a very interesting premise. It's about a scientist or roboticist who is celebrating that he's just gotten a new job with his wife, who's played by Stacey Martin, and the scientist is Theo James, and they get into a terrible car accident, and ostensibly his wife is killed, and there's a new technology called Archive, which allows someone to continue to communicate with somebody's consciousness even after they've died for about 200 hours. Then after that, they're gone. The machine that carries them, which is called their archive, is then buried. So the scientist has become somewhat desperate. He goes to this assignment, which is in Japan, and it's on a very strange house that's sort of elevated, and the only way to get to it is a sort of an aerial bridge, and located in the middle of a forest, kind of in the middle of nowhere. And he's working on a robot, several robots. The first robot that he created, which he calls J1, and that his wife's name is Jules, so J is for Jules, is kind of a moron. It's a big, lumbering, hulky kind of thing that can just walk around, and it has the intellect of about a 6-year-old, and all it wants to do is watch cartoons all day. Then he's created J2, which is more humanoid but still robotic, has a face and can speak, hear, and talk, but it has the mental capacity of about a 16-year-old. And the J2 becomes aware that he's working on a more advanced robot, basically a humanoid android called J3, and starts to become jealous. He says, well, why don't you just improve me? Why do you have to build this new version? And starts becoming petulant and acting kind of strange and sort of sabotaging some of his work. And he starts becoming angry. At one point, it seems like she's stolen J3 or hidden. But it turns out that the corporation he's working for is upset with him. He wasn't supposed to be doing this. He was supposed to be working on something else. And they didn't know he was, building these robots. And he said, well, these are, all our intellectual property, and, you don't really have any rights to them. But he argues with them that that's not true, and, begs to, please let me finish this last one, and then I'll stop. And they reluctantly relent. And so he completes the J3, which has its own it becomes humanoid. It has its own personality, and starts developing it, and even to the point of having sex with it, and then it becomes aware that he is planning to transfer the archive of his wife into the body of this android. At first it objects, she objects I should say, and then doesn't want to go through with this, and she eventually relents, realizing how desperate he is and somewhat sad. There's kind of an attack on his house by apparently rivals of the corporation he was working for that want this technology, and he's surrounded. He can't get out. The house controls are locked down. He's in kind of a desperate situation, and then suddenly they just vanish. You're like, what just happened? And now J3 has integrated the personality of Jules, of his dead wife, and she begs him he hears the telephone ring. She begs him not to answer it, and he does anyway. And on the telephone, he hears his wife's voice and the voice of his daughter, and she's saying, "Goodbye, Daddy. Mommy says we can't talk to you anymore." Turns out he's the one who was killed in the car accident, and everything we've seen is actually his archived brain fantasizing about what would have happened if his wife had been killed. His archive expires, and he is buried, and his wife and daughter say goodbye as Toby James and his people are burying him. I thought that was brilliant. I thought it was kind of a very different exploration of AI and its possibilities, and also, the possibility of at least limited immortality or electronic extension of life, which I think are very good science fiction ideas. I hope you've enjoyed this list, and I hope you'll go out and see some of these films if you haven't seen all of them already. Archive is available on Tubi, and a lot of these others are available on YouTube and other streaming services. So have fun.